The fog had rolled in thick and heavy that night, swallowing the narrow alleys of Paris as if hiding a secret too dangerous to reveal. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Inspector Maigret sat behind his desk, his pipe glowing faintly in the darkness. The city seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the next twist in a case that refused to let go. Outside, the faint sound of a bell tolled midnight, the only sound punctuating the stillness. Somewhere in the distance, a life was slipping through Maigret's grasp. A witness had disappeared, leaving behind only a trail of unanswered questions. What had they seen? What did they know? And what, exactly, had they feared enough to vanish into the shadows? As the inspector leaned back, his thoughts tangled between the cold logic of the case and the growing unease in his chest. A name came to him. A name that had been whispered in the dark corners of the cafes where secrets were traded like currency. He was about to chase the missing witness into the heart of a mystery far larger than he could have ever imagined. Would he be able to catch the shadow before it slipped beyond his reach? Or was the truth already out of his grasp? Before we begin unraveling this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Join Maigret as we delve deep into the foggy streets and hidden corners of Paris, where every answer only leads to more questions. The telephone on Maigret's desk rang just as he was about to pour himself another measure of Calvados. It was nearly midnight, and the building at the Quai des Orfèvres had fallen into that strange half-silence when even the hum of the Seine outside seemed to slow down. He glanced toward the rain-smeared window, then picked up the receiver with a sigh. A hoarse voice on the other end told him the witness, the only man who could confirm what had really happened in the narrow courtyard of Rue Saint-Louis, was gone. Not dead, not arrested. Simply gone. Maigret stayed still for a moment after hanging up, the weight of the pipe between his fingers grounding him in the dim lamplight. Disappearances were not rare in Paris, but this one had the sharp smell of something deliberate. The witness, a railway clerk named Jules Renaud, had seen something he shouldn't have. He'd come forward reluctantly, stammering through his statement, eyes darting toward the window as though someone might be listening even there. And now, 3 days later, he had melted into the fog. He left the office without a word to anyone, pulling his heavy overcoat around him as he descended the stone steps to the embankment. The air outside was thick, damp, carrying with it the distant rattle of a tram somewhere beyond the river. He lit his pipe, watching the smoke curl and vanish into the mist. There was something about cases like this, the ones that began quietly, without spectacle, that always unsettled him. They had a way of creeping under the skin, of making the familiar feel uncertain. By the time he reached Rue Saint-Louis, the street was almost deserted. A few dim lights glowed behind the curtains of small apartments. The witness's landlady, Madame Cruzet, stood at her doorway, shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, her face pinched with worry. "He left this morning," she said when Maigret asked. "Said he was going to fetch bread. Never came back." She hesitated, then added in a whisper, "But someone was watching from across the street. I saw a man with a hat, just standing there. Didn't move for an hour." Inside Renaud's small room, everything was as ordinary as a life half-lived. A threadbare jacket over a chair, a cold stove, a photograph of a young woman in a worn frame on the mantelpiece. Maigret walked slowly through the room, his fingers brushing the edge of the table where a single teacup still stood, a faint ring marking the wood. There was no sign of struggle, no hurried packing, no clue that the man had planned to leave. Yet his coat was gone, and so were his shoes. The inspector bent to pick up a small, folded paper that had fallen near the bed. It was a receipt from a café near Gare du Nord, dated that very morning. The next stop was inevitable. He arrived at the café just as the owner, a thin man with a drooping moustache, was closing for the night. The smell of tobacco and spilled wine hung in the air. "Renaud?" the man repeated, rubbing his chin. "Yes, he was here around noon, sat by the window, didn't touch his drink, looked like he was waiting for someone. Then a fellow came in, grey coat, clean-shaven, the kind that doesn't belong in a place like this." They spoke quietly. After a few minutes, both of them left together. The man hesitated, glancing toward the door as if the fog outside might still be listening. "I remember because they didn't pay." Maigret nodded, his eyes drifting toward the empty chair by the window. He could almost see Renaud there, tapping his fingers against the table, glancing at the door, the nervous rhythm of a man already aware of danger. The inspector jotted a few words in his notebook, though he already knew most of this would come down to instinct. It often did. He thanked the owner and stepped back out into the night. The streets around Gare du Nord were still alive even at that hour, though most of the movement came from shadows. Porters finishing shifts, women with scarves pulled low, the silent fraternity of those who belonged to the late Paris. Maigret walked slowly, letting his eyes and ears adjust to the rhythm of the place. Somewhere, he thought, Renaud had turned a corner and vanished into this sea of anonymity. Someone had helped him disappear, or silenced him. He stopped at a small kiosk where a newspaper boy was dozing under a flickering lamp. The latest edition was spread out before him, its headlines damp from the mist. "Man missing after murder in courtyard," one read. The story was brief, little more than a few lines, but it was enough to stir gossip in the cafes by morning. Maigret frowned. The press had gotten wind of it too soon. That meant someone wanted the disappearance known. But why? Back at his apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, the clock struck 2 as he removed his coat and set it carefully on the chair. Madame Maigret stirred in her sleep when he entered, her familiar silhouette outlined by the dim light from the hall. He watched her for a moment, comforted by the stillness, before retreating to the kitchen. The kettle hissed softly as he poured himself a cup of tea and leaned on the window-sill. The fog had thickened, swallowing the street lamps until they glowed like orbs in another world. Somewhere out there, a frightened man was hiding, or being hunted. He thought of Renaud's eyes during that first interview, the way they had darted toward the door whenever a footstep echoed in the corridor. People like him didn't just vanish, they were made to vanish. And Maigret knew the difference. The next morning brought a pale light and a thin drizzle. At the station, Janvier was already waiting, files in hand. "No sign of him at the railway stations or ports," he said. "But we found this." He handed Maigret a torn piece of paper, its edges damp. Written on it, in hurried strokes, were 3 words. "Rue des Martyrs. Tonight." Maigret's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Tell Lucas to have a man watching that street from dusk," he said quietly. "And no uniforms. Whoever arranged this wants us to be seen. Let's make them wait." By evening, Paris had once again folded into itself, the wet stones reflecting the dull gold of the street lamps. Maigret stood in the shadow of a shuttered shop on Rue des Martyrs, collar turned up, pipe clenched between his teeth. The rain had turned to mist, blurring the outlines of the buildings. He waited. It was just past 10 when a figure appeared at the far end of the street, thin, hesitant, glancing over his shoulder with each step. Renaud. The inspector felt a strange relief, though he didn't move. The man crossed the street and approached a doorway opposite Maigret's hiding place. For a moment he fumbled with something in his pocket. A key, perhaps? And then froze. Another shadow detached itself from the wall behind him. The sound that followed was small, almost swallowed by the night, a single, soft thud. By the time Maigret crossed the street, the doorway was empty. Only a cigarette butt glowed faintly near the gutter, and beside it Renault's hat lay upside down in a puddle. The inspector crouched beside it, the rain dripping from the brim of his own coat. Somewhere in the dark, a door clicked shut. Maigret rose slowly, his face unreadable, and turned toward the end of the street where the shadow had vanished. The witness had reappeared, only to disappear again, this time for good. He exhaled, the smoke curling upward into the mist like a silent question. The Café des Artistes sat on the corner of Rue Le Pic, half hidden behind the glow of its own yellow lamps. The rain had passed by morning, leaving the pavement slick, reflecting the slow drift of clouds above Montmartre. Inside, the café was nearly empty. Only a few regulars murmured over their coffee cups, and a radio whispered an old chanson through the haze of cigarette smoke. Maigret pushed open the door and paused just long enough to take in the room before choosing a seat in the far corner. He had been here before, years ago, during a case that began with laughter and ended in tears. The same smell lingered, wet wool, cheap wine, tobacco, and something indefinably Parisian. That mixture of melancholy and endurance. A waiter with the thin patience of a man used to late customers approached, notepad ready. "Just coffee," Maigret said, removing his hat and setting it beside him. The cup arrived moments later, steaming gently, and Maigret let it sit, untouched, as he studied the room. The café had been mentioned twice now, once in Renault's receipt, and again by a man whose name had surfaced that morning in the report from Lucas. Henri Vaudreuil, a former customs clerk, turned consultant, though the kind of consulting he did usually involved a good deal of silence and a steady hand with a pistol. Vaudreuil was known in certain circles for arranging disappearances, people, documents, even reputations. He was a man who made things vanish. If Renault had crossed paths with him, it meant the case was shifting from the domestic to something darker. At the counter, the door creaked open and a man entered, heavy-set, grey overcoat, hat pulled low. Not quite elegant, but deliberate in his movements. He ordered a vermouth without looking up, then turned slightly, scanning the room the way men do when pretending not to. Maigret didn't move, but his eyes followed the man's reflection in the café's long mirror. The stranger glanced toward a table in the back corner where a woman sat alone, her gloved hands wrapped around an empty cup. She was young, though her face carried the tiredness of someone who had lived several lives too quickly. When she finally met the man's gaze, something like recognition flickered between them. Not affection, but fear disguised as familiarity. The inspector waited until their conversation began before lighting his pipe. The faint click of his lighter drew a glance from the waiter, nothing more. Through the drifting smoke, he could hear fragments. "Haven't got it. He promised." And then, more quietly, "The witness is gone." That last phrase cut through the room like a blade. Maigret leaned forward, pretending to search his pockets for matches. When he looked up again, the woman was leaving, her coat fluttering behind her like a signal. The man waited a few seconds, paid, and followed her out. Maigret stood, dropped a coin on the table, and followed in. Silence. Outside, the air had that cold clarity that follows rain. The two figures turned toward Boulevard de Clichy, their steps quick but not hurried. Maigret kept his distance, the heels of his shoes silent against the wet pavement. They stopped near a tobacconist's shop, and the woman pressed something into the man's hand. A folded envelope, perhaps. Words passed quickly between them before she vanished into a passing crowd of market-goers. The man tucked the envelope into his coat pocket and began walking toward Pigalle. When Maigret reached the corner, the man was gone. He waited a moment, listening. Somewhere down a side street, a car engine turned over, then faded into the distance. The inspector turned back toward the café, retracing his steps until the familiar yellow glow appeared through the mist again. Inside, the waiter was wiping the counter. "That man who was here earlier," Maigret said quietly, showing his badge. "Do you know him?" The waiter frowned. "He comes sometimes, doesn't talk. Always the same order. Vermouth, leaves a big tip." "Name?" "None that I know, monsieur." Maigret nodded, then added, "And the woman?" The waiter hesitated. "She's been here before, once with him, once alone. Always looks frightened, never stays long." When the inspector stepped outside again, the street was busier, the sounds of morning life growing louder, car horns, laughter, the calls of newspaper boys. He turned toward the direction of Pigalle and walked slowly, the weight of the morning pressing down on him. Somewhere between those brief conversations and the envelope, the thread of the case had shifted. The missing witness was no longer just a frightened man. He was part of something structured, deliberate, the shadow of a network that moved in whispers. By noon, he was back at the Quai des Orfèvres, pipe in hand, staring out the window. The Seine flowed sluggishly, reflecting the pale winter light. Janvier entered, holding a telegram. "From the prefect's office," he said. "They're asking for updates." Maigret nodded but didn't turn around. "Tell them the witness has reappeared," he said dryly. "For about 3 minutes." Janvier looked puzzled. "You found him?" Maigret finally turned. "Not exactly, but I found the man who found him. And now I have to find them both." He picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory. "Lucas? Get me a full list of known associates for Henri Vaudreuil, anyone who's been in or out of the cafes near Gare du Nord in the past 3 days. Cross-check with the night porters. And Lucas, keep it quiet." He hung up, leaned back, and closed his eyes. The rhythm of Paris beat faintly in the distance. Carriages, voices, the occasional whistle of a train leaving for the provinces. He thought again of the woman's face at the café, that brief, terrified look before she turned away. She knew more than she dared to say. That evening, as dusk settled over the river, Maigret returned to the Café des Artistes. The same waiter, the same smoke, the same music. He ordered another coffee and waited. Outside, the fog began to thicken again, pressing against the glass like a living thing. He had the feeling that someone was watching him, not closely, but with the patience of someone waiting for him to move first. He didn't. Hours passed. The café emptied. Finally, the waiter came over and said softly, "Someone left this for you, monsieur." He placed a folded note on the table, the edges damp. Maigret opened it slowly. Inside, a single line written in hurried, nervous script. "Stop asking about the witness. Some stories aren't yours to tell." Maigret smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. He slipped the note into his coat pocket and finished his coffee in silence. Outside, the fog had swallowed the street once more, and Paris was beginning to dream its dangerous dreams again. He lit his pipe, stepped into the cold, and disappeared into the mist. The city had that bruised look it often wore in early winter, grey, sullen, the air thick with damp coal smoke. Maigret walked alone along Boulevard de Rochechouart, his hands buried in his coat pockets, the collar turned up against the chill. The events of the previous night had not left his mind. The note, written in a trembling hand, had been more than a warning. It had been a signature. Someone was watching, perhaps even guiding his steps. At the corner near Rue des Martyrs, he paused. The street was quiet now, emptied of the daytime bustle. Only the sound of dripping water echoed from the eaves, and in the dim light of the lamps the cobblestones gleamed like wet glass. Maigrè's instincts told him this was where he needed to be, not the busy cafes or crowded boulevards, but here, where the city whispered its truths to those who listened. He leaned against a lamp-post, lit his pipe, and waited. The smoke curled upward, mingling with the mist, carrying with it the familiar scent of tobacco and rain. Moments later, footsteps approached, slow, cautious. A figure emerged from the fog, moving with a wary rhythm that immediately drew Maigrè's attention. It was a young boy, no more than 12, with a wool cap pulled low and a bundle of newspapers under his arm. When he saw Maigré, he froze. "Evening," Maigré said quietly. "You work around here?" The boy nodded, eyeing him warily. "Sometimes," he said. "Depends who's asking." "I'm asking," Maigré replied, showing his badge. "I'm not here to cause trouble. Just want to know if you saw a man pass through here last night. Tall, grey coat, clean-shaven." The boy hesitated, then shrugged. "Maybe. Lots of men like that, but one of them, he wasn't from here. Walked like he knew where he was going, had another man with him, didn't talk much. Just stopped in that alley." He pointed toward a narrow passage between two shuttered shops. Maigré glanced toward it. The alley was a dark vein slicing through the block, barely wide enough for a man to pass. "And what happened then?" The boy shifted his weight. "Didn't see. Heard something like a door closing, maybe. Then nothing." Maigré handed him a coin. "If you remember more, you come to the Quai des Orfèvres. Ask for me." The boy pocketed the coin, nodded once, and vanished back into the fog, leaving Maigré alone with the silence. He walked into the alley, the damp walls closing in on either side. The smell was of wet stone, old garbage, and the faint iron tang of something else, blood. At the far end, a small wooden door stood ajar. The light from the street barely reached it. Maigré pushed it open with his gloved hand. Inside was a courtyard, a forgotten space hemmed in by tall tenement walls. A single lamp burned faintly above a stairwell, throwing a sickly yellow glow across the ground. The place was deserted, but Maigré could feel the ghost of movement lingering there, as if someone had stood watching only moments before. He crouched, examining the ground. The puddles reflected the lamplight, but in one corner the surface was disturbed, mud, footprints, 2 sets, both recent. He followed them to a wooden crate near the wall. Something glinted beside it, a matchbox, half-crushed, bearing the insignia of the Café de l'Europe. He recognized it instantly. That café was no more than a few streets from Gare du Nord, the same quarter Renaud had last been seen. A connection, faint but solid. He pocketed the matchbox and stepped back into the night. By the time he reached the Café de l'Europe, the city had sunk fully into darkness again. Inside, the atmosphere was thicker, louder, rougher than the quiet café of the day before. Men argued over cards, glasses clinked, and a thin accordionist played in the corner without enthusiasm. Maigré slipped inside unnoticed, the hum of voices washing over him like the river's current. At the bar, he ordered a calvados and watched the room through the mirror. Near the back sat a man he recognized from an old file, Lucien Prévost, once a railway porter, now a courier for hire. He was speaking to someone half hidden by the pillar, gesturing with quick, nervous movements. Maigret saw the faint outline of the other man's profile, the same grey coat, the same deliberate posture. Vaudreuil. Maigret sipped his drink, letting the warmth spread through him. He needed to hear what they were saying, but he also knew that pressing too soon would send both scattering like startled birds. Instead, he waited, watched. The conversation seemed to grow tense. Prévost leaned in, muttered something, then glanced nervously around. Vaudreuil's reply was calm, measured. He reached into his coat, pulled out an envelope, and slid it across the table. Prévost hesitated, then took it, slipping it into his own pocket before standing abruptly. That was Maigret's moment. He set down his glass, rose, and intercepted the man at the door. "Lucien Prévost," he said quietly, "you and I need a word." The man froze, then tried to back away, but Maigret's hand was already on his shoulder, firm, immovable. "You've been running errands again," Maigret continued. "For whom, I wonder?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Prévost stammered, eyes darting toward the door. "Don't," Maigret said softly. "Not tonight." He led him back toward a side table, ordered another drink, and waited until the man's shaking hands steadied. "Renaud?" Maigret said finally. "Where is he?" Prévost swallowed. "I don't know, I swear it. He was supposed to meet someone here 2 nights ago. He never showed. Vaudreuil said he'd taken care of it. I didn't ask what that meant." "Why were you meeting him tonight?" "To pass a message." Maigret leaned in. "Whose message?" Prévost's voice dropped to a whisper. "Someone at the ministry. I don't know names, I just carry things. They said the witness was dangerous, that he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to." "And what was that?" But the man only shook his head. "Ask Vaudreuil," he said, "if you can find him." When Maigret looked back toward the table where Vaudreuil had been sitting, the chair was empty. The door at the back of the café was swinging gently open. By the time Maigret reached the alley behind the building, there was no one left, only the smell of smoke and the echo of footsteps already too far away. He stood there for a long moment, pipe clenched in his teeth, the mist curling around him like a living thing. The city whispered again, as if mocking him. He had lost the shadow, but not the trail. In his pocket, the crushed matchbox pressed against his fingers, a small, silent promise that the night was far from over. He turned toward the street, the glow of the lamps blurring in the fog, and began to walk. By dawn, the city had turned cold and brittle, the kind of morning when Paris seemed to exhale frost from its lungs. Maigret sat in his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, the same pipe resting between his fingers, the same steady trail of smoke climbing toward the ceiling. But his thoughts were far from the comfort of ritual. Somewhere, between the dim corridors of the Café de l'Europe and the narrow alley where Renaud had vanished, a network of whispers was forming, a chain of voices passing secrets from one to another until truth became rumor, and rumor became danger. The reports lay scattered across his desk, names, addresses, half-truths scribbled by tired detectives. But what drew Maigret's attention wasn't the ink, it was the silence between the lines. Too many people were pretending not to know, too many were talking just enough to keep suspicion alive without revealing anything at all. That, more than anything, told him he was close to something that people were afraid of. He rose, shrugged into his coat, and told Janvier, "Come, we're going walking." They crossed the Pont Neuf as the river rolled beneath them, sluggish and grey. The markets were opening, vendors shouting half-heartedly as the morning fog clung to their awnings. Maigret moved slowly, eyes scanning the faces of passers-by. The baker, the newsman, the woman carrying a crate of apples. Each seemed ordinary, but in Paris, the ordinary was always where the extraordinary hid. Their first stop was Rue des Petits Champs, where the witness had once worked at a small accounting firm. The building's caretaker, a balding man with suspiciously clean hands, met them at the door. "Renaud? Ah, yes. Quiet fellow, kept to himself. But lately, he seemed nervous. Said he was being followed." "You think that was true, Inspector?" Maigray's gaze lingered on the man's polished shoes. If he said so, it was true enough for him. From there they moved to a cafe across the street, one of those establishments that had seen better years. The owner, Madame Gallet, was wiping down the counter, her bracelets clinking with every movement. "Renaud came here often," she said. "Sat by the same window, always reading the papers. Once, he told me he'd found something in an account ledger that didn't make sense, a transaction that vanished between pages. He said it was nothing, but he never came again after that." Janvier glanced at Maigret. "Money laundering?" "Possibly," Maigret murmured. "Or something worse." They stepped back into the street, where the fog had begun to lift. The city stretched awake, the smell of coffee and damp stone mingling with exhaust and perfume. Maigret had always loved this hour, the moment between the private and the public, when the secrets of the night were still clinging to the walls before daylight burned them away. He paused by a lamp-post, lighting his pipe again. "You hear it, Janvier?" he said softly. Janvier frowned. "Hear what, Chief?" "The city. It's talking." And it was. Not in words, but in murmurs carried through the rhythm of footsteps, the creak of shutters, the low chatter of voices echoing off the facades. Paris was full of whispers, and Maigret had spent a lifetime learning how to listen. Somewhere in that constant hum was the truth he needed. Their next lead came from a note slipped under the door of the station that morning. "If you want to know what Renaud saw, ask at Rue Mouffetard after dark. Ask for the miller." By the time they reached the street that evening, the fog had returned, curling through the narrow lanes like breath from an unseen mouth. The shops were closing. The grocers had drawn their blinds. The butcher's window was empty, save for the reflection of the gaslight. A street singer somewhere nearby was playing a sad tune on an accordion, his voice cracked from drink. They found the miller behind a bar with no sign, just a red curtain and the smell of brandy. He was a man built like the wooden beams that held up the place, broad, solid, and scarred by life. "You're asking about the clerk," he said after Maigret showed him his badge. "Renaud, I warned him, told him to leave Paris while he still could. But he thought he was safe. None of us are safe, Inspector, not when the people at the top decide a story shouldn't exist." "What story?" Maigret asked. The miller's eyes flicked toward the door before he leaned closer. "A company, imports and exports, that's what they call it. But half the goods never arrive and the papers disappear. Renaud was tracing payments for them. Money that went missing reappeared under different names. He didn't know he was looking at the wrong kind of numbers. Who runs it? Names change, faces change. But I've heard one more than once. Vaudreuil. He's the one they send when they need something." "Erased." Maigret nodded slowly. "And where would I find him now?" The miller gave a bitter smile. "Find him? No one finds Vaudreuil. He finds you." Outside, the street had grown darker, the lamps burning with a tired yellow light. The air smelled of rain again. As they walked back toward the main road, Janvier broke the silence. "You believe him?" Maigret shrugged. "He believes himself. That's enough." They stopped at a cafe for warmth the kind where the tables wobbled and the floor creaked. A radio hummed softly in the corner, broadcasting the evening news, a politician's scandal, a railway strike, a murder in Lyon. Ordinary crimes, and for ordinary men. Maigret stirred his coffee, watching the rain bead against the window. "Every time a man disappears," he said quietly, "there's someone who profits from his absence. The trick is finding out who." Janvier said nothing. He had learned over years beside the inspector that when Maigret's voice took on that low, thoughtful tone, the case had shifted from evidence to intuition. When they left the café, the streets were nearly empty. They walked in silence until they reached the corner of Rue Saint-Vincent, where the fog had thickened again. Somewhere behind them, a door closed softly. Maigret turned. Nothing. Only the whisper of rain and the faint glow of a lamp reflected in the puddles. He exhaled through his pipe, the smoke mingling with the mist. "They're following us," he said quietly. Janvier glanced over his shoulder. "You're sure?" "Quite, and that's good." "Good? It means they're nervous." They continued walking until the sound of footsteps behind them finally faded. When Maigret looked up again, he saw the faint outline of Notre Dame in the distance, its towers vanishing into the night sky like watchmen keeping their secrets. The city had stopped whispering, for now. But Maigret knew better. Paris never truly slept, it only waited. And somewhere, in that patient, fog-covered silence, the next clue was already forming, just out of reach, just quiet enough to make him chase it. By morning, the sky over Paris hung low and colourless, as though the clouds themselves were eavesdropping. The streets shone with last night's rain, and in the gutters the reflections of lamps trembled like dying stars. Maigret stood outside the Café des Artistes again, pipe unlit, his breath curling in the chill. The night's events still pressed against his thoughts. The whispering informant, the alley that seemed to watch from every shadow, and the sense that someone far beyond his sight was orchestrating it all. Inside, the café was half empty. A few regulars murmured over their newspapers, eyes flicking up when the door creaked open. The smell of burnt coffee and stale smoke lingered in the air. Maigret took his usual seat and waited, his overcoat heavy with damp. Janvier entered a few minutes later, carrying a brown envelope. "They found him," Janvier said quietly, sliding into the chair opposite. Maigret didn't ask who, he already knew. "Prévost?" Janvier nodded. "In the river, near Pont d'Austerlitz, wallet gone. No sign of struggle, but—" He hesitated. It wasn't an accident. Maigret stared out the window, where the fog thickened once more, swallowing the shapes of the city. "No," he said softly. "It never is." He took the envelope and opened it. Inside were photographs. Grainy, water-stained, but clear enough to see the man's lifeless face. There was something about the eyes that struck Maigret. They looked less like eyes that had seen fear and more like eyes that had seen something too heavy to carry. He placed the photos back on the table and said, "Get Lucas and tell him to find out who signed the coroner's report. I want the name before noon." When Janvier left, Maigret stayed behind, lost in the quiet rhythm of the café. A woman was sweeping the floor, humming a tune too soft to recognize. Somewhere outside, a tram bell rang and faded. The city moved on, indifferent. But Maigret knew better. Indifference was often the mask of guilt. By midday, he was back at the Quai des Orfèvres, where Lucas was waiting with another file. "The coroner's name is Vautrin," Lucas said. "But here's the curious part. He's not the one who signed it. His assistant did. The signature doesn't match any official record." Maigret looked up sharply. Meaning someone forged it, Lucas nodded. And whoever did wanted the report buried fast. The inspector rose slowly, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. Then we're getting close. He lit his pipe and walked to the window. The Seine below glistened dully, the water thick and slow-moving. There's an unseen hand in this, Lucas, he said. Someone high enough to bend the rules, but careful enough to stay invisible. Lucas frowned. You think it's political? Maigret shook his head. Not yet, but it's organized. A machine that hides itself behind paperwork and silence. Renaud stumbled into it, Prévost tried to warn us, and Vaudreuil, he trailed off. Vaudreuil is the blade, not the mind. A knock came at the door. Madame Torrance, the receptionist, entered, holding a telegram. For you, Chief. Arrived just now. Maigret unfolded it. The message was brief, typed in block letters. Stop chasing shadows, you've already met one. He stared at the words for a long moment, then smiled faintly. They're getting impatient. That evening, he returned once again to Rue des Martyrs. The rain had ceased, but the streets were slick, gleaming under the lamplight. The shops were closing, their shutters slamming like punctuation marks in the silence. He stopped near the doorway where Renaud's hat had been found. The puddle was gone now, but the memory of it lingered. A sound caught his ear, the faint scrape of a shoe against stone. He turned slowly. A man was standing a few meters away, half hidden, beneath the archway of an old print shop. Evening, Inspector, the man said, his voice calm, polished. You been busy? Maigret didn't answer. The man stepped forward, revealing the angular face of Henri Vaudreuil. He wore the same grey coat, perfectly dry despite the damp air. Renaud is dead, Maigret said. I know. You killed him? Vaudreuil smiled faintly, almost politely. I prevent complications. He was becoming one. And Prévost? The smile didn't fade. Complications often multiply. For a long moment the two men regarded each other, the hunter and the ghost of his own pursuit. The lamplight caught the edge of Vaudreuil's coat, turning it silver against the night. You're not untouchable, Maigret said finally. No one is, Vaudreuil replied. But some are harder to reach than others. He took a step closer, and Maigret caught the faint scent of cologne, something foreign, too expensive for a man who claimed to be freelance. You're wasting your time, Vaudreuil said. The witness was a pawn. There are bigger pieces on the board and you're not invited to play. Then why warn me? Vaudreuil tilted his head. Because I respect you, Inspector. You're thorough, and you still believe truth matters. That's rare. With that, he turned and disappeared into the alley, his footsteps echoing once before vanishing into the fog. Maigret didn't follow. He stood there for several minutes, the weight of the encounter settling into him like the night air. Then he took out his notebook and wrote a single line. Vaudreuil, Heidsche messenger, not architect. Back at his apartment, Madame Maigret had left a pot of soup warming on the stove. The domestic smell filled the small kitchen, grounding him momentarily. He sat at the table, poured himself a bowl, and stared at the steam rising in slow spirals. He thought of the message, of the forged report, of the quiet way the river swallowed its dead. The case was no longer about a missing witness. It was about a system, invisible, methodical, and alive. As the clock chimed 11, Maigret set down his spoon. Somewhere out there, in an office or a drawing room lined with velvet curtains, someone was deciding which lives were allowed to matter. He leaned back, the shadows of the room soft against his face. You can hide, he murmured, but sooner or later Paris talks. Outside, the wind began to rise again. carrying with it the low murmur of the streets, a whisper, building into a warning. And Maigret listened. The following morning arrived without light. Paris lay under a heavy blanket of fog, thick as breath against the windows of the Quai des Orfèvres. The kind of morning, Maigret thought, when the city seemed to exist only in outline, as if someone had sketched it in pencil and forgotten to ink the lines. He sat at his desk, reading through the reports Janvier and Lucas had left overnight. There were too many details, too many conflicting accounts. Everyone claimed to know something, yet no one knew the same thing twice. He poured himself coffee that had long gone cold and leaned back in his chair. On the corner of his desk, the photograph of Renaud stared back at him, with the same uneasy expression, as if the man had been listening to someone whisper in his ear right before the picture was taken. At 8:30, Lucas entered, brushing rain from his coat. "We've found a lead," he said. "A woman named Léonie Morel works at the Ministry of Commerce, claims Renaud came to see her 2 weeks before he vanished." Maigret looked up, pipe in hand. "What did he want?" "She says he was carrying documents, ledgers, reports, told her he'd uncovered discrepancies in the import tariffs between Paris and Antwerp. She thought he was drunk. He left without saying more." "Did she tell anyone?" Lucas shook his head. "She didn't think it mattered." "Everything matters," Maigret murmured, rising. "Let's go." The ministry was an imposing building of grey stone and silence. Civil servants moved like ghosts through its corridors, their polished shoes tapping against marble floors. Maigret found Léonie Morel in a small office lined with filing cabinets. She was pale, thin, her hair pinned tightly behind her head. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted her spectacles. "I remember him," she said after a long pause. "He seemed frightened, kept looking over his shoulder. He said he'd found something wrong in the books, figures that didn't balance. He asked if the shipments listed were real. I told him I only typed what I was given." "What shipments?" "Textiles. But there were other things too. Machinery, medical supplies. The paperwork was always incomplete, as though pages had been removed." Maigret exchanged a glance with Lucas. "And who oversaw these imports?" Léonie hesitated, then whispered, "Monsieur Carville. He's been here for years. Untouchable. Does he know you're speaking with me?" "No, Inspector, and I'd prefer it stay that way." As they stepped back into the corridor, Lucas muttered, "Carville. That name's come up before, twice, in cases that went nowhere." "Because someone wanted them to," Maigret replied. Outside, the fog had thickened again, curling through the courtyard like smoke. The inspector paused on the steps, pipe unlit, mind tracing the shape of the puzzle forming before him. Renaud had found discrepancies, Prévost had carried messages, Vaudreuil had erased the evidence, and above them all, someone was moving the pieces. That afternoon, a telegram arrived from Liège. It was brief. Shipment 14B missing. Documentation incomplete. Carville referenced. No signature. Only an address. Rue Oberkampf. Maigret wasted no time. By evening, he and Lucas were standing outside a warehouse on that very street, the air thick with the smell of damp rope and motor oil. Inside, workers moved crates under the dim yellow light of kerosene lamps. The foreman, a squat man with heavy hands, approached. "We've already spoken to the customs men," he said defensively. "Everything's in order." Maigret smiled faintly. "Of course. Then you won't mind showing me the manifests." The man hesitated, then gestured toward a cluttered desk. The inspector sifted through the papers, invoices, delivery slips, export tags. Most were routine, but one at the bottom of the stack was different. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, but the date was wrong, backdated by nearly a month. The signature, too, was familiar. Carville, Maigret said softly. When they left the warehouse, the night air felt colder. The fog carried the scent of the river, heavy and metallic. Lucas walked in silence beside him, hands deep in his pockets. "So that's it," he said finally. "Carville's behind it all. Renaud discovered the falsified shipments, and Vaudreuil silenced him." Maigret didn't answer right away. "Maybe," he said, "but perhaps it's too neat, too convenient. You think it's a setup? I think someone wants me to believe it's Carville, which means it isn't." By the time they reached the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret's doubts had hardened into certainty. On his desk lay a fresh envelope, no name, no stamp. Inside was a single photograph, Vaudreuil standing beside Carville at a formal banquet, both smiling, wine glasses raised. On the back, in red pencil, someone had written, "Look higher." He sat down, exhaled slowly, and lit his pipe. The flame caught with a soft hiss, filling the office with a thin haze of smoke. "We've been led by the nose, Lucas," he said. "Someone's placed breadcrumbs where they wanted us to walk." "Then what do we do?" Maigret smiled without warmth. "We stop following." That night he returned home late. The lamps along Boulevard Richard Lenoir burned dim behind curtains of mist. Inside the apartment, the sound of Madame Maigret's soft humming drifted from the kitchen. She looked up as he entered, her expression weary but gentle. "You've eaten nothing again," she said. He smiled faintly. "I've been chasing ghosts." "You'll catch them," she said, pouring him soup. "You always do." But as he sat there, spoon in hand, he wasn't sure. For every ghost he caught, another seemed to appear, faceless, nameless, but always watching. The city had grown quieter now, the hour when even Paris seemed to hesitate between dream and waking. He rose, crossed to the window, and looked out over the wet cobblestones below. Somewhere, not far away, a man was laughing in the dark, a sound that didn't belong to joy but to confidence. The laugh of someone who knew he had been found only when he wanted to be. Maigret turned from the window, his reflection caught in the glass, beside the city's faint glow. "All right," he said softly to no one in particular. "Let's see where you lead me next." Outside, a single car rolled past, its headlights cutting through the fog for a brief, fragile moment, like a clue half glimpsed, half forgotten, waiting to be found. By mid-morning the next day, Paris had shaken off the fog but not the tension. The sky was pale, the air brittle, and the streets hummed with a deceptive calm. Maigret crossed the Place Dauphine with his overcoat buttoned high, the smell of roasted chestnuts drifting from a vendor's cart. It was one of those mornings when life pretended to be ordinary, but under that thin crust of normalcy, something restless stirred. He was on his way to the Hôtel d'Artois, an elegant but fading establishment near the Boulevard Saint-Germain, where a woman named Claire Vaudreuil had requested to see him. The surname alone was enough to make him cautious. Henri Vaudreuil had vanished into the shadows again, and now his wife, or perhaps his widow, wanted to talk. The clerk at the desk recognized Maigret immediately, bowed slightly, and pointed him toward the first-floor lounge. The room was quiet, curtains half drawn, the scent of lilacs faint under the smell of stale perfume. Claire Vaudreuil stood by the window, tall and slender, a figure of composure marred by the tremor of her cigarette. "You've been looking for my husband," she said, before Maigret could speak. Her voice carried a practiced calm, the kind that had learned to hide fear behind manners. "You won't find him." Maigret set his hat on the table. That depends on where he's hiding. She turned, meeting his gaze. Her eyes were a pale, almost colourless grey, the eyes of someone who had seen too much and stopped reacting. He doesn't hide, Inspector. He disappears. There's a difference. He studied her in silence. The morning light cut across her face, catching the fine tremble in her hands. Why did you ask to see me? I thought you should understand what you're walking into, she said, lowering herself onto the armchair. Henri works for men who do not write their names down. You think he's the killer, but he's only the messenger. There are others, the ones who own ships that never arrive, warehouses that hold crates no one opens. My husband delivers the silence they pay for. Maigret's pipe remained unlit in his hand. And you, what part do you play in his silences? She smiled faintly, bitterly. The part every wife plays, pretending not to know. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. Renaud came to me once before he disappeared. He thought Henri might protect him. He was wrong. Henri told him to leave the city, that the papers he carried were too dangerous. He gave him money, but it was already too late. They were watching him. Who? Her cigarette trembled. A man called Delmas. He works with the ministry, but not for it. He's the bridge between the offices and the docks. If you want to know where the trail ends, find Delmas before he finds you. There was a knock at the door. Soft, polite, but heavy with intent. Claire froze. He's here, she whispered. You must go. Maigret rose, hat in hand, but before he could reach the door, it opened. A tall man in a dark overcoat stepped in, his expression unreadable. Madame Vaudreuil, he said smoothly, you should have told me you had company. His gaze slid to Maigret, polite but cold. Inspector, what an unexpected pleasure. Maigret studied him. The man had the kind of confidence that came from authority without uniform. His voice was measured, his movements economical. Monsieur Delmas, I presume? The man smiled without warmth. I see my reputation precedes me. Your reputation travels faster than your shipments, Maigret said quietly. Delmas's eyes hardened, but his smile remained. Careful, Inspector. Paris is not kind to men who go digging in other people's ledgers, nor do those who fill them with ghosts. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Delmas inclined his head slightly. A pleasure, as always. I'm sure we'll see each other again soon. He turned to Claire. You should rest. These conversations are tiring. When he left, the silence in the room was like the pause after a shot. Claire stood, crossing to the window, watching as the man disappeared into a waiting black car. Now you understand, she murmured. There are no sides left, Inspector, only those who can afford the truth and those who can't. Maigret placed his hat back on. Everyone pays, madame. The question is when. Outside, the street had filled with light, but the air still carried that peculiar chill, the kind that made one feel observed. As he walked toward the corner, he noticed a man reading a newspaper on the opposite side of the street. The same man had been standing by the chestnut cart earlier. Maigret slowed, turned abruptly, and crossed the road, but by the time he reached the corner, the man was gone. Back at headquarters, Lucas was waiting with a file. Carville's office called, he said. They want to cooperate, offered to hand over documents about the shipments. Too fast, Maigret muttered. They're trying to steer us again. Lucas frowned. So what do we do? Maigret looked toward the window. We make them think it's working. That evening, Maigret visited the ministry. The corridor outside Carville's office smelled of floor wax and fear. The bureaucrat himself sat behind a wide desk, his bald head gleaming under the lamp. "Inspector," he said with forced geniality, "you're wasting your time. I've already explained everything." Maigret leaned against the desk. "Explain it again." Carville's eyes flickered. "The ledgers are complicated. Imports, exports, taxes. Clerical errors happen. And dead clerks?" The man hesitated, then forced a smile. "I'm sure you'll find whoever's responsible." "I will," Maigret said, "and I'll make sure your name's spelled correctly in the report." When he left the building, the night air struck cold against his face. He turned onto Boulevard Saint-Michel, where the lamps burned like weary eyes. He knew now what he had suspected since the beginning, that the trail wasn't leading upward, but sideways. A web of connection stretched across the city, linking the docks to the ministries, the cafes to the courthouses. And somewhere inside that web, someone was tugging the strings. By the time he reached home, it was past midnight. Madame Maigret had left a light burning in the kitchen, a quiet gesture that grounded him in a world that still made sense. He poured himself a glass of brandy and sat by the window, watching the empty street. The fog had begun to return, rising from the river and curling around the lamp-posts like smoke. He thought of Claire Vaudreuil, her trembling hands, her grey eyes, her weary honesty. Somewhere in her sadness was a key, something she had not said, perhaps could not. He took a long breath, the scent of tobacco mixing with the faint sweetness of rain. In that stillness, he heard again the rhythm of the city, the invisible pulse beneath its stones. Paris was whispering again, and Maigret was listening. The wind off the Seine carried a chill that night, sharper than the days before. Paris had wrapped itself in silence, the kind that feels deliberate, as though the city itself were waiting for something. Maigret stood by the open window of his office, staring into the darkness. The lamp on his desk cast long, tired shadows across the papers, reports, telegrams, notes scribbled in his own hand. All of them circling the same unanswered question: who was truly pulling the strings? The telephone broke the stillness. He lifted the receiver with a kind of reluctant familiarity. "Maigret?" a voice whispered, barely audible. He froze. It was Claire Vaudreuil. "They've taken him," she said. "Henri, they came tonight. A car with no plates, men in coats. I heard shouting, then nothing. You have to find him before—" The line went dead. For a moment, Maigret stood completely still, the pipe cooling in his hand. Then he set it down and reached for his coat. The night outside was ink black, the streets slick with fresh rain. He hailed no cab. He walked, and the kind of walk that clears neither thought nor conscience. Every step echoed in the emptiness, the sound of a man moving through a city that didn't want him to arrive in time. When he reached the Hôtel d'Artois, the clerk's face told him everything before words could. The lobby was empty except for a single glove lying on the marble floor. Claire's, he was sure of it. In the lounge upstairs, the curtains were drawn back, one torn slightly at the seam. The scent of her perfume still lingered in the air, faint beneath the smell of cigarette smoke. A half-drunk glass of cognac sat beside the telephone. He noticed the telegram slip pinned beneath the receiver. It bore only 3 words: Pont Marie, midnight. Maigret folded it slowly and slipped it into his pocket. It was nearly 11:30. The bridge was nearly deserted when he arrived. The lamps along the embankment glowed weakly through the fog, their reflections trembling in the water. He stood beneath one, pipe between his teeth, coat collar up, eyes scanning the far bank. Then he saw her. Claire, standing alone at the centre of the bridge, her coat drawn tight, her face pale against the night. "I thought you were gone," he said as he approached. "So did I," she replied, voice low. "They told me Henri was alive. They said if I came here alone, I could see him again." "Who told you that?" Before she could answer, a figure stepped from the shadows on the far side, tall, familiar, Vaudreuil. His coat collar was up, hat brim low, face unreadable. Behind him, another shape flickered briefly and disappeared, the silhouette of a second man watching from the embankment. "Henri," she whispered. He stopped a few paces away. "Claire, you shouldn't have come." Maigray's eyes moved between them, measuring every pause, every glance. "Where is Delmas?" he asked. Vaudreuil gave a weary smile. "Everywhere, Inspector. Nowhere. He's the air in these streets. You'll never see him unless he wants you to. And yet you're here." "Because I'm finished running," Vaudreuil said. He turned to Claire, his tone softening. "You have to leave, my dear. They won't let me talk, but I had to see you one last time." The wind rose suddenly, whipping her hair across her face. "Henri, please!" A sound cut through the night. A single muffled pop. Then another. Claire gasped, staggered backward. For a heartbeat, the world held still. Then she fell into Maigray's arms. He dropped to his knees, his coat darkening where the blood spread. Across the bridge, Vaudreuil was already gone, the echo of footsteps swallowed by the fog. Maigret looked up, searching for the shooter, but there was nothing. No shadow, no flash, only the faint smell of gunpowder carried by the wind. He held her as the seconds bled away. Her lips moved once, barely a whisper. He tried to stop them. Then she was still. The sirens came late, long after the river had swallowed its reflection of the bridge. By the time Janvier arrived, Maigret was standing at the railing, his face unreadable. "Get a car to the quay," he said quietly, "and seal every road around Pont-Marie. No one leaves tonight." When they returned to headquarters, Maigret went straight to his office. He said nothing to the men waiting there, not about the bridge, not about the woman. He simply took the telegram from his pocket and laid it on the desk beside the cold pipe. Pont-Marie, midnight. Lucas entered a few minutes later. "They found a car abandoned near Rue des Bars," he said. "No plates, smell of gunpowder inside." "Fingerprints?" "Wiped clean." "Any witnesses?" "None willing to speak." Maigret nodded. "Then we're closer than they think." He sat in silence for a long time after Lucas left. The city outside had gone back to its usual rhythm. Distant laughter, the rumble of a tram, a dog barking in some unseen courtyard. But for Maigret, the night had changed shape. It had teeth now. He took out his notebook and began to write, his handwriting deliberate, the letters steady. Vaudreuil, not killer. Delmas, shadow. Claire, silenced. Purpose, unknown. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added a final line, follow the message. At dawn, the call came. A porter from a telegraph office on Rue de Lille reported a disturbance. A man had entered after hours, sent a single coded transmission, and disappeared before the police arrived. The clerk described him as tall, grey coat, clean-shaven. Maigret rose from his chair. The pipe in his mouth went cold. "He's not finished," he murmured. Outside, the first light of morning stretched over the city, pale and uncertain. The Seine moved quietly beneath the bridges, carrying away everything the night had chosen to forget. And above it all, a single thought took root in Maigret's mind, as clear and cold as the dawn itself. The next message would not come by telegram. It would come in person. The day began with sunlight, sharp, cold, and indifferent. After nights of fog and rain, it should have felt like relief, but to Maigret it only made the city's imperfections stand out more clearly. The cracks in the pavements, the soot on the stones, the shadows beneath the windows of people who had learned to look away. Paris was awake, but it was a city pretending not to hear the echo of gunfire that had carried over the Seine only hours before. He hadn't slept. The image of Claire falling into his arms had played again and again behind his eyes. Not because he was sentimental, Maigret was long past that, but because it had been so needless, so absurdly human in its inevitability. She had been silent to keep him listening to the wrong thing. He stood in his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, staring down at a map of the city spread across the desk. Pins marked the docks, the cafes, the warehouses, the hotel, the bridge. Together they drew a pattern that made no sense, until he looked at it sideways. Then he saw it. All the places formed a corridor of movement leading east, toward the old industrial quarter beyond Belleville, the place where the city's quiet business was done and forgotten. Lucas entered, carrying a folder. "We traced the telegraph," he said. "It came from a private line inside the Ministry of Transport. Guess who authorized it?" "Delmas," Maigret said flatly. Lucas nodded. "But here's the twist. He resigned yesterday morning. Officially, he no longer exists in the Ministry's records." "Of course not," Maigret murmured. "Ghosts don't file pensions." He reached for his coat. "We're going for a walk." They drove through the tangle of narrow streets near the canal, where warehouses leaned like tired men over the water, a place of barge smoke and rusted iron. Few people lived here now, just dock workers, old thieves, and men who preferred not to be found. They stopped outside a brick building with a faded sign, Société Maritime d'Importation. The name meant nothing, but the address matched one that Renaud had written in the margin of his ledger. The door was locked, but not well. Inside, the air smelled of oil, damp, and secrecy. Crates were stacked along the walls, each marked with shipping numbers and countries Maigret doubted had ever seen their supposed cargo. In one corner stood a desk, the kind used for paperwork, that was never meant to be seen. On it, a small lamp burned, still warm. Someone had been here minutes ago. He motioned for Lucas to check the upper floor, then began to examine the papers scattered across the desk. A folder lay open, filled with invoices bearing the same signature, repeated over and over, A. Delmas. Attached to one of them was a photograph, not of goods or ships, but of people. 5 men standing in front of a government building. Renaud was one of them. Another was Carville. And at the centre stood Delmas, smiling faintly as if the world belonged to him. A sound above made Maigret look up. Footsteps, then a shout, cut short. He ran for the staircase. Lucas lay on the landing, dazed but alive, blood on his forehead. "He's here," he gasped. "Top floor." Maigret climbed the stairs 2 at a time. The corridor above was narrow, the air close and dusty. At the far end, a door was swinging open. He stepped through, and there was Delmas, standing by an open window, the city spread behind him like a map of unfinished crimes. "You're late, Inspector," Delmas said calmly. "I expected you sooner." "Your messenger was very persuasive," Maigret replied. Delmas smiled faintly. "Ah, Vaudreuil, efficient man, loyal, up to a point." "Where is he?" "Gone. He made the mistake of believing loyalty was a virtue." Maigret took a step closer. "You had him killed." "I corrected an imbalance. Renaud, Vaudreuil, the others, they all thought they could speak. But what they knew wasn't truth, Inspector. It was noise. The world runs on silence. That's what men like me provide." "And Claire?" Maigret asked quietly. For the first time, something flickered behind Delmas's composure, the smallest tremor of discomfort. "Collateral," he said after a pause. She interfered. Maigret drew his revolver, but he didn't raise it. "You've built a fine web, Delmas, but every web has a center, and you've been standing there too long." Delmas stepped closer to the window, the morning light turning his face pale. "You think justice means something here? You think the courts will touch me? You've seen enough to know better." Maigret's voice was steady. "You're right. They won't. But they'll remember your name, and they'll know who buried the truth beneath the Seine." A slow smile crossed Delmas's face. "You'll never find the evidence." "I don't need to," Maigret said. "You just told me everything." For a moment, neither man moved. Then, from somewhere in the street below, came the sharp wail of a police siren. Lucas's doing, no doubt. Delmas turned his head slightly, and Maigret saw the flicker of decision before it came. The man lunged toward the window. The inspector fired once. The shot cracked through the still air, echoing down the alley outside. When Maigret reached the window, the street below was empty except for the scattering of pigeons startled into flight. No body, no sound. Only the faint ripple in the river beyond the warehouse wall. By the time the others arrived, there was no sign of Delmas. Only his coat remained, folded neatly on a chair beside the desk, and beneath it a sealed envelope addressed in precise handwriting, to Inspector Jules Maigret. Back at headquarters, he opened it, alone. Inside was a single sheet of paper, blank except for one line. "You can't arrest a shadow." He stared at it for a long time, then folded it carefully and placed it in the case file. There would be no trial, no confession, no closure, only the quiet satisfaction of having pulled the thread long enough to see the pattern. That night, Maigret walked home along the river. The lamps flickered in the breeze, the water whispering against the stone embankments. Somewhere in the distance, a barge horn sounded low and mournful. He thought of the faces, Renaud, Vaudreuil, Claire, all swallowed by the same machine that kept the city running. It was not victory he felt, nor defeat, but something quieter. The familiar weight of understanding that in Paris, justice was never absolute. It came in fragments, glimpses, a truth half seen through smoke. He reached his apartment, removed his coat, and set his pipe on the table. Madame Maigret was asleep. He poured himself a small calvados, stood by the window, and watched the lights along the Seine flicker like dying stars. Tomorrow would bring another case, another silence to break. But tonight, Paris seemed to breathe again, a city that had swallowed its ghosts for now. He raised his glass to the darkness. "To the unseen hand," he murmured. Then he drank. The fog returned to Paris as though the city itself refused to let Maigret end the case without a final act of theatre. It rolled low over the river, softening the lamps, swallowing the edges of bridges and turning the towers of Notre Dame into ghosts. Maigret walked the embankment slowly, his coat buttoned to the throat, the brim of his hat heavy with mist. He had not reported Delmas's letter to the prefecture yet. There was nothing in it they would understand, and no confession, no proof, just an admission that the invisible always rules over the visible. He reached the Pont Neuf and stopped, leaning on the railing. Beneath him the water moved sluggishly, dark and indifferent. The same river that had taken Renaud and almost certainly Vaudreuil was still carrying their secrets out toward the sea. Maigret had chased ghosts before, but this one lingered differently. It had a smell: tobacco, typewriter ink, fear. Behind him, footsteps. He turned. Janvier approached, his cap pulled low, his face drawn by sleeplessness. "You were right," he said without preamble. "They found Vaudreuil's body near the canal this morning, shot twice. Whoever did it didn't want him to float." Maigret nodded slowly. They tied the ends neatly, as always. "There's more," Janvier continued. "The ministry's auditors showed up unannounced. Carville's been dismissed. And Delmas, there's no trace. His apartment's empty, bank accounts closed, nothing left." "Except the silence," Maigret said. They stood there for a while, both men watching the current. The inspector's pipe hung unlit between his fingers. The city hummed faintly beyond the fog. Trams clanging, bells striking the half-hour, the murmur of life resuming its indifferent rhythm. "You think he's still here?" Janvier asked quietly. "Oh yes," Maigret said. "Men like Delmas never leave. They change names, offices, mistresses. But they stay in Paris, because where else would the shadows find such comfort?" Janvier hesitated. "And what about you, Chief? You going to close it?" Maigret didn't answer right away. He drew in the cold air, the faint smell of the river, mixing with the sweetness of roasting chestnuts from the quay. "Then," he said, "I'll close it when the fog lifts, not before." Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the station had the hollow quiet of an ending. Papers were filed away, typewriters covered, the long corridor echoing with the sound of doors shutting for the night. Maigret's office light was the last still burning. He sat behind his desk, staring at Delmas's envelope. It lay open now, the single line inside stark against the white page. "You can't arrest a shadow." He thought about all the years behind him, the rooms full of smoke and silence, the confessions that came too late, the faces that blurred into memory. The world kept turning, and men like Delmas kept moving beneath it, greasing its hidden gears. But Maigret had seen enough to know that even shadows left footprints, faint, irregular, but real. He took a fresh sheet of paper and began writing his final report. It was concise, factual, almost cold. Case, disappearance of Jules Renaud. Result, subject, deceased. Associated persons, Vaudreuil, deceased, Claire Vaudreuil, deceased, Delmas, missing. Cause, corruption and concealment linked to unauthorized trade between public and private entities. Status, closed, pending further evidence. At the bottom he paused, then added in smaller script, almost as a whisper. The witness was not lost, he was silenced. He signed it, folded it, and placed it on the pile of finished cases beside the lamp. Then he opened the window. The night air came in heavy and damp, carrying the faint murmur of the Seine. He could see his own reflection in the glass. The broad face, the steady eyes, the man who had stared too long into the fog without blinking. The sound of a clock chimed across the city, a dozen echoes from unseen towers. Somewhere a newspaper printer clattered to life, setting the next day's truth in ink. He turned off the lamp. The office fell into half-darkness, only the ember of his pipe glowing faintly like a watchful eye. As he stepped into the corridor, the echo of his shoes followed him all the way to the door. The guard on duty nodded sleepily, unaware that another case had just joined the thousands that filled the archives, another story no one would tell, except the city itself. Outside, the rain had begun again, fine and cold, the kind that blurred the line between air and water. Maigret pulled his collar higher and started across the square toward home. The glow from the street lamps shimmered on the wet stones, each step stirring the quiet rhythm of the night. At the corner, he paused. A woman passed by carrying flowers wrapped in newspaper. The faint scent of lilies followed her into the fog. It reminded him, absurdly, of Claire. He watched her disappear, then turned toward Boulevard Richelieu, where Madame Maigret would already be setting the table for his return, certain he would come back late, but not worried. She had long ago made peace with the hours the city stole from him. As he walked, the fog began to thin, lifting in pale ribbons over the rooftops. The river gleamed faintly, the first sign of dawn touching its surface. Paris was waking. He stopped on the bridge, looking back once more at the water, the city, the lamps dimming against the new light. The case was over, or as over as such things ever were. He struck a match, lit his pipe, and took a slow, thoughtful draw. The smoke drifted upward, curling into the morning like one last unanswered question. Behind him, the sound of the Seine, steady, eternal, carried the city's secrets away once more. And Maigret, weary and certain, walked home through the thinning mist. End.